Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is good to be with you today, Thursday, October 3rd. Take a minute, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Check out the other work we have. Tomorrow, we have another episode at 11 that I need to get up on the schedule. We'll be visited by Renee Johnston from Saturdays with Renee, Jared Ball from Black Liberation Media, and Kichi Ya as well. And so we'll be talking a little bit about elections, propaganda. Um, I think we'll get into a little psychological warfare kind of discussion too around it, and just media narratives and so on. Today is really a conversation. There's a lot of things to discuss. We had a long conversation last night with the Shihais, but we haven't done a lot. That was the first conversation we'd really had since the front with Lebanon became a much, much bigger thing. And we're it's October 3rd, right? So we're approaching a year since October 7th. Um, and so there's a lot of developments to talk about, as well as I think some to talk about, how October 7th really changed the world, and that, things there that after that we don't have a new, you know, we still don't know the new world that was sort of brought into being, or was initiated, or was started in terms of that day, the full significance of that day. Um, so with me, I have two guests who are both, frequent at this point contributors. As folks know, Abdaljawad Omar has been on here a number of times, as a writer, analyst, and lecturer based in Ramallah, Palestine. He has written extensively in Arabic, in English. Abood has contributed to Electronic Intifada, Mondo Weiss, and Ebb Magazine, among other outlets. Fathi Nimer is Al-Shabaka's Palestine Policy Fellow. He previously worked as a research associate in the Arab world for research and development, a teaching fellow at Birzeit University, and a program officer with the Ramallah Center for Human Rights Studies. Fathi holds a master's degree in political science from Heidelberg University and is a co-founder of Decolonize Palestine. And that's the context in which he and his partner Rowan have joined the show multiple times before, to talk about their work there, as well as do one of the things that website does so well, which is break down so many of the common myths and elements of propaganda, as well as provide a good background in Palestinian history. Palestine, or decolonizepalestine.com, is a knowledge repository for the Palestinian question. Fathi's research revolves around political economy and contentious politics. His current focus is on food sovereignty, agroecology, and the resistance economy in Palestine. And initially, that was the conversation that we wanted to have. So a couple of weeks ago, when I reached out, he wasn't able, because he was traveling, to have the conversation at that time. But I was like, hey, I really love these new articles that you've written on the West Bank and on food sovereignty and resistance. And so we will have that conversation. But because there's so much that has happened in the last 2 weeks, we were like, yeah, we'll probably need to talk a little bit more about kind of some general analysis of what is going on right now. And we'll revisit that, because I do think the conversation around food sovereignty within resistance movements is an important one. I think it's an international one, but there's some very specific dimensions of it that his work highlights in the West Bank and, in Palestine more broadly, and the some of the problems that come about when you don't have any sort of food sovereignty, but also how that can contribute to your ability to resist and so on. So anyways, without saying more, welcome to the show, Fathi and Abood. It's good to be with you both again.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Jared.
Yeah, always good. And really fun that I'm happy that, it worked out that we could have both of you together for this discussion. I appreciate both of your work, and I look forward to hearing you both in conversation with each other as well. So, um, Yeah, I mean, so a lot has happened in the last couple of weeks. I mean, I think the last time that we talked, Aboud, we were talking about kind of how we had seen the shock, right, of the Israeli doctrine for the last year, but we hadn't yet seen any sort of awe-inspiring moments. And I think that's still true to some extent. However, if you leave it to the Western press, they would they would talk about the awe-inspiring moments of the last couple of weeks. And in particular, I I want to start kind of with thinking about Syed Hassan Nasrallah. We haven't done much on. We talked about him a little bit yesterday, but he was martyred about a week ago now, I guess. And I just wanted, if each of you could say a little bit from your perspective about the importance of him as a figure for both Palestine and Lebanon. And I want to decouple that a bit from the impact that this strike has on Hezbollah as an organization and a party, because I think that um, they're a sophisticated, well-established party with decades of history at this point, as well as succession plans and things like that. And so we see their ability to continue to fight and to defend, and the ability to launch rockets, as well as um, lure the IOF into traps and things like that in Lebanon. But for a minute, I want to talk about Nasrallah as a figure, um, and uh, and just talk about that importance of him within the region, within Palestine, and for the axis of resistance from your perspective.
Fathi, do you want to go first?
Whatever you like.
Um,
Okay, sure. I think for Palestinians, especially Palestinians my age, I think we kind of have a different kind of, maybe let's call it, memory of the Middle East for people born after in the 2000s and such. The idea that South Lebanon was occupied territory, like that seems like it was like in the West Bank today and such. That seems something out of like a sci-fi novel or something. Like that's absolutely something you can't imagine. But that was the reality of how we were growing up, or at least how we started learning things. I mean, the liberation of Lebanon happened when I was a young teenager, let's just say. So that was one of the first kind of milestones. And with this context, this is how you start to learn about Sayyid Hassan and how his effects are on the region. So he's been a part, like a firm part of the balance and the equation in the region about from the moment basically I came to political awareness. The war in 2006 was also a very pivotal moment for a lot of Palestinians and for the understanding that, yes, this army can actually be beat, that the Israeli army is not this impossible force that is just tearing everything down. Yes, they can kill a lot, they can damage a lot, they can murder a lot of civilians, but they can be militarily defeated. And that's kind of the context where Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah comes. Like, this is something to aspire to, it is something to, it showed us that this is the way that things need to go, because we've been like, I've grown up all my life under the Oslo paradigm trying to kind of find this solution that nobody can agree on and nobody wants to actually go through in reality, but they show us that there's actually an alternative. And I don't think that the way that they inspired other resistance movements as well, and their tactics and ideologically as well, it cannot be understated. So it's a terrible loss, of course, and we don't want to talk about like the capability effects or such, but he basically built a movement. He's been the leader of Hezbollah for all my life, basically, and he'll be terribly missed. But he established a strong movement, and that inspired so many people around the world, and I don't think that could be taken away.
yeah, I mean, I share Fathi's outlook on this. I mean, I think the moment that people heard that Israel, I mean, from the beginning of the various attacks that Israel has committed in Al-Dahi in Beirut, and with every bomb dropped on Al-Dahi, people were scared that the target would be Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah. And I think that the moment when this huge explosion blowed up, everybody knew that this is something qualitatively different than the previous assassinations that took out some of the most important and key leaders in the Hezbollah military command. And people realized that probably the target would be Hassan Nasrallah. And I think that for many, it was, Friday and Saturday were days of, silence and shock, with a bit of hope that, he would have made it out or survived. So there was these emotions. I mean, I spent the whole day just staring with my friends, and we didn't really speak. So, I mean, it was a tough day. And slowly and subtly, the realization dawned that, Nasrallah was targeted, and this leader who was important and fundamental, as Fathi described, has now become a martyr. And it's a big loss. It shouldn't be underestimated. There are few people in history that combine both the charisma, personality, smarts, and ability to build the movement and energize it, like Nasrallah. And his important is, high. I mean, for us in Palestine, the idea of the Lebanese resistance has always been kind of etched with the people that beat the Israeli army. And, even when we confront interrogators or army officers on checkpoints, when they're attempting to humiliate us, a lot of Palestinians would tell those soldiers, go and try to do that in Lebanon, for instance. So it was, the Lebanese resistance has always been something that empowered us. We feel a sense that somebody has our back, that somebody is still confronting the state that is attempting to cleanse us, also teaching it lessons along the way, breaking its military in 2006, freeing southern Lebanon in 2000. And, part of Nasrallah's, of course, charisma and charm and pedagogy and philosophy is also etched to his credibility as a leader of a movement that actually was successful. And I think this is important and fundamental. I mean, it wasn't only Nasrallah's persona that made people attracted to him. It was also the relationship between his persona and the movement that he embodied and represented, that in fact, in actuality, in reality, was able to beat Israel on several historical crossroads, and that understood how to navigate its military build-up, how to create opportunities for, coming out victorious with a formidable military that is highly sophisticated, like the Israeli army. So that persona is a persona of, I think, hope. And for a lot of Palestinians, his speeches were speeches that also imbued a sense of hope. He could both teach history, give you a religious, a religious theological discussion, provide you with highly sophisticated geopolitical analysis. And I think one of Nasrallah's biggest assets as a person who represented the movement was that he was able to also fold within his speeches the attacks against the resistance and dispelling them. So he was this kind of he was a thinker in his own right. I mean, his thinking, of course, it still represents a movement. It's political, It has propaganda elements. It's meant to deter the enemy. It has political messaging, but there's also this highly pedagogical aspect to his speeches that, you know, when people listen to them, they also can grasp what's happening in the region and what's going on and what should be done and not done. And, you know, so there's that type of engagement with an audience, with a people that Nasrallah respected, by engaging them in a logical, dialectical, and, if you want, highly pedagogical discussion and speeches. And that's what made him also quite different. He wasn't only, you know, speaking rhetoric or, you know, creating, you know, a illusion for the masses. He was in many ways engaging in respecting the mind of those who are receiving the speech, you know? And that built a lot of credibility, coming on the heels of these historic victories that the Lebanese resistance, specifically Hezbollah, was able to actually you know, emerge. And that's why he's important and fundamental. But I think, like, you know, like Fathi also said, I mean, this is a big movement. It's not a small movement. The past couple of weeks was the toughest in its history. The blows that it suffered were not, you know, simple at all. It's not totally surprising that these blows happened, to be honest, because if anybody understands what Israel has been doing in the past 16 years, it was highly focused on gathering intelligence, in building the ability for operational shock like the ones we've seen. I'm not saying the type of operations were not necessarily surprising, but, you know, there's about, you know, there's estimates that are different, but there's about 40,000 intelligence officers as Israel has. Of course, we should take into consideration that Israel is not acting alone, that it has the entire Western intelligence services in its service that share with it information and provide it with, you know, a power multiplying effect. And since 2006, since Israel was beaten in South Lebanon in the war, Israel basically has been focused quite a lot on ways to defeat and shock Hezbollah as a resistance movement. And so the ability to reach these leaders, the ability to shock through, you know, the pager explosions or the walkie-talkies, are part of this kind of operational design that it has created for a war with Hezbollah. And, you know, it included, or it went all the way up to assassinating Nasrallah himself. So, yeah, I mean, that has been the topic in the past, let's say, 2 weeks. But I think, like anything else, the arrogance of the Zionists and, you know, tells us something else about Nasrallah. Nasrallah really penetrated the psychology of Israel, the simple Israeli, you know, not only the government, not only the military. So he wasn't just a figure that was loved or revered or perhaps antagonized even within the Arab world, because, you know, at least in the past 10 years with, you know, the civil war in Syria, you know, Hezbollah also lost some of its popularity and support coming from the larger Arab world, and with, you know, the imperial core also hearkening towards this Sunni Shia divide that also served to, like, you know, break, if you want, the consensus around the Lebanese resistance that existed up until 2006 with the Syrian civil war. But I think what is central is that Hezbollah, or Nasrallah in specifically as a person, has penetrated Israel's psychology. He became embedded as their worst nightmare. A capable, competent, credible leader with a credible history of attacking and defeating Israel, and with the ability for his words to become, you know, part of an engagement with the Israeli side, meaning that, you know, his words would set rules of engagement, his words would be listened and heeded. And, you know, for Israel, taking out Nasrallah is also a big psychological victory, or they think of it as a big psychological victory. They think that they've reversed Nasrallah's quote, which is, Nasrallah said in 2006, I think maybe 2000, I'm not sure, that Israel is, more fragile than a spider's web. And the first thing that Netanyahu said after assassinating Sayyed Hassan Nasrallah is that our enemies thought that we're more weak, or we're weaker than a spider's web. And now look at our enemies. So I think that kind of symbolism, that kind of give and take and exchange with this figure, and for Israel to be able to take him out through the 80 tons of bombs that it dropped in the Dahiya, for it's now high in its own kind of victory and own kind of psychological riddance of this person that in many ways, again, was able to become part of Israelis' worst nightmare. So he wasn't only revered and respected and loved by a lot of people, not only is he important for his pedagogical relationship also to the masses, not only for building the movement, not only for building a movement that was credible in terms of its ability to challenge the Israelis on the battlefield and come out victorious, but also because he was central to the voice of this axis of resistance more broadly, but also for the impact that his words had on the Israeli psyche. And I think for Israelis now looking at this, it's not surprising that they're celebrating, and they were celebrating by giving out, sweets on the streets, because this is kind of like a symbolic victory, but also one that is highly psychological for regaining some sort of power after the loss of power that they've faced since October 7th. I mean, we can talk about it more. I don't want to. I took too much time.
Yeah,
No, you're
I
fine.
think you went into a brilliant analysis, but I thought the question was a bit more personal. But thank you for the analysis, because I absolutely agree with everything. And also, they were talking about giving out the sweets, even on the checkpoints. They were taunting Palestinians with that on the checkpoints, and if you refused to take a sweet, they would beat you there for the men. So it's they understand how important Nasrallah was to the psyche of Palestinians, and they're trying to employ that. But the key difference is that when we see someone as a martyr, it doesn't drive us into despair. It kind of spurs us on to kind of live up to their ideals. So I'm sure we can talk more about that also later.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I think, well, maybe let's stay there for a bit, right? Because now we have, we have the ground invasion, this limited, limited operation ground invasion, right? And for a couple of days, it was sort of like announced, but wasn't actually, happening. Like nobody actually had invaded, and then, I mean, since then, it seems as though the IOF has walked into a number of ambushes, which I think is to be expected. Maybe say a little bit about the invasion of Lebanon, and given all of the losses that Hezbollah has obviously, taken in the last couple of weeks. Nonetheless, there is the battlefield, right? And there is the capabilities there. Um, and I'm as you said, you both kind of mentioned that they're a bit high, as we would say, high on their own supply is the term that we would use in the West. But a bit, maybe psychologically it kind of bolsters a feeling of invincibility or such that leads to then actions that could potentially also change the trajectory of this war a little bit. And I don't know. I mean, we don't, as Abud and I have talked a lot, and neither one of us really, and I imagine you're the same, Fatih, like we don't believe in inevitability. Like it's not that we can predict the exact outcome of what will happen, but um yeah, I mean, how do you, as you're watching the ground invasion and seeing the increasing airstrikes in Lebanon, like, and maybe we'll get to the territorial ambitions and things like that in a bit, I know, but what are your kind of initial reactions to what's going on there?
Well, I mean, they're definitely high on their own propaganda for sure. I mean, Israel really needed a win in one way or another, a propaganda win, because they've been talking about dismantling Hamas, dismantling Hezbollah, or doing this or doing that, and all of these goals that are, if you're any objective observer, will see it's not possible. Like they've been basically genociding Gaza for the last year, and every other day we still see an ambush by Hamas that claims a bunch of Israeli soldiers. So they do need that kind of propaganda. They do need that boost to kind of Netanyahu specifically needs that kind of boost to be able to say that, look, I went to this war and I achieved this. Israel's largest number one enemy has been defeated. And you know that the thing is that there were very similar headlines in Israeli newspapers in '92 after the assassination of Musa, which was Nasrallah's predecessor. They said that we will no longer have to worry about Hezbollah, and that didn't end up playing out how they wanted at all. They assassinated the senior leadership of Hamas during the Second Intifada, and that led only to October 7th afterwards, because it's just not how guerrilla movements work. It's not how irregular armies work. It's not how people fighting for liberation from colonialism work. Otherwise, it would have been the world would look very different. So, if anything, the ability of Hezbollah within just a couple of days to be able to launch so many salvos of missiles and rockets at Israel, and to be able to kind of mobilize a defense force in the south and anywhere they've been trying to kind of sneak into, they've been trying to go in from multiple areas of Lebanon, from the Galilee, from further south. They've been not able to go in more than what 1 kilometer at maximum, if what their propaganda says is true, and that's basically nothing. They have to remember that guerrilla warfare is not like a regular army. They have to lure people into ambushes, they lure people into the territory, so it's not like, oh, well, they were able to penetrate into the territory. That's not how it works. So the fact that Hezbollah is able to put up such strong defense really kind of shows how adaptable it is, how it was able to kind of reform itself. And it's Hezbollah itself said that they have redundancies for the redundancies. Every commander has a deputy commander, and I'm sure that deputy commander also has another deputy. So it's not like you can't decapitate a mass movement. It is a mass movement. I mean, according to the estimations, we're talking about at least 100,000, and that's only officially declared by Sayyed Nasrallah. So that's what's declared officially. And those soldiers, those resistance members, do not disappear if some of the leadership was assassinated. Of course, it's also in the interest of Israel to act like they just assassinated all of the leadership. Well, there's also no evidence for that. And I think another thing that maybe a lot of people are too young to remember, but the war of 2006, there was an incredible amount of censorship from the Israelis. There was an incredible amount of, not admitting any losses and kind of exaggerating everything that they were accomplishing, to the point that after the war, people were confused about what actually occurred, because it's not like anything that the propaganda of the Zionist state was talking about. So I think that a lot of that will also come out in the coming months. I don't know, Abu, do you have anything to add?
Well, I mean, the thing about Israel moves in Lebanon is that, it seems that their project is to build a security zone, or to at least, I mean, the minimalist thinking around this is that they enter the territory and then they try to compromise with Hezbollah based on, taking hold of some territory, so that the settlers would return to the north without this whole Gaza, so decoupling and delinking. The rhetoric that we're hearing from Israeli leaders is that they want to deal a deadly blow to Hezbollah and change the entire paradigm of how the region looks strategically. And if that's the case, I mean, we're going for a long war, meaning years to come. It's not going to end, anytime soon. Israel will probably enter southern Lebanon and build a security zone there, trying to depopulate, the population close to the border in Lebanon, and return to kind of a situation that existed before 2000, if we want. And now it's returning to the situation before 2005. In Gaza, it's, you know, expanding in Netzarim and Philadelphia corridors and building, you know, army bases within the Gaza Strip. And in Lebanon, it's expanding once more into a territory. Eventually, if Israel is willing to pay the price, probably it would be successful in establishing a zone. Probably. I mean, we don't know. They might, you know, reach a stalemate. They might not be able to withstand the losses that they will face within a ground battle with Hezbollah in the south. But what is certain is that they're preparing themselves for a long war of attrition with forces that are well equipped and well trained. But not only that, with a high motivation now, since you've killed their important leader, to avenge him. And at the same time, you know, a sophisticated arsenal that is capable of regenerating. And that's what's important about it, that is different than in Gaza, is that in Lebanon, at least, you know, Hezbollah has access to weapons and manufacturing of these weapons, and that would probably continue for a long time to come. So there's no magical bullet or solution in Lebanon. Even if you go and place a security zone and you're successful in doing that, let's assume that they do that, Hezbollah still has mid-range rockets, long-range rockets that can hit the entire north and even the entire, you know, strip of land that we call historic Palestine. And at the same time, it has the ability to continue fighting for a long, long, long time. We're talking about, you know, Hezbollah gave a figure of 100,000 fighters. It might be more, it might be less, who knows. We're talking about a strategic picture of, you know, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and weapons availability. You know, if in Gaza, by choking Gaza and making, you know, force regeneration more difficult, you might be able to lessen the capacity of resistance to continue. It has to think differently in terms of the economy of power use, if it wants to go for a long-term battle, because the conditions in Gaza are just much more dire in terms of even guerrilla warfare. But that's on the level of terrain and the level of size of the Gaza Strip and the level of force regeneration. I mean, a lot of people underestimate what it means to actually build a guerrilla force in Gaza and equip it with weapons. But, you know, it's one of the miracles of, you know, the 21st century in terms of how people have, you know, committed themselves to that. But it's a difficult task. Lebanon is mountainous. It's difficult. It's a rugged terrain. It's a different geography and layout. It's larger. It has, you know, and the fighters that are fighting are not, you know, some foreign people. They're the, you know, they're the sons and daughters of these villages and towns, and they know them like the back of their hand. And in many ways, you know, Hezbollah has the advantage in a ground war, not Israel. It's his playground or their playground more so than Israel, and we've already seen signs of that. Since the very moment that, you know, Israeli forces entered, they're already incurring heavy losses in terms of injuries and killing, according to their own confessions, of course. And I think that will just continue as long as Israeli army is within Lebanon itself. So that's a picture when it comes to Lebanon. And what it looks like is that Israel has also, I mean, I'm careful about saying that, but Israel has also played its most important cards in terms of shocking Hezbollah. It assassinated the military leadership and Hassan Nasrallah himself. It committed these pager and walkie-talkie attacks, but it doesn't seem to have large tricks thus far. I mean, we don't know if they will approach the ground invasion differently, and they will learn from the 2006 and, you know, either change the type of maneuver or use different elements, or perhaps, you know, do airfalls, or, you know, there are a lot of scenarios for how a ground invasion would actually move on. But, you know, their most, let's say, shocking tricks when it comes to Hezbollah, at least, maybe with Iran, they have some other tricks to play. But expecting the unexpected, you know, it seems that they have already expended some of the things that they have already worked on for a long time, including intelligence gathering and, you know, combining intelligence with air power or with, the ability to penetrate Hezbollah's communication system, etc. And I think the impact of these operations, as important as it is to Israel, because it did, at a cognitive level, show Israel has some tricks to play, that it could penetrate the Hezbollah movement on some level. I mean, Hezbollah has historically been hard to penetrate on intelligence level. But there's a lot of reasons for that as well, which is, first, is that it expanded. I mean, once you expand, you also risk, more penetration by hostile forces. Hezbollah has also expanded a lot of forces in Syria, and interacting with a lot of different actors has a role to play with intelligence gathering, but also intelligence being able to implant maybe human resources within the organization, or getting its hand on information, or using technological means or other forms of intelligence gathering operations to be able to get to key leaders and to the communication infrastructure. But I think that in essence, if we're assessing the past 2 weeks beyond the psychological shock of what happened, the movement is still intact. Hezbollah hasn't used its power or force yet, which is important. It hasn't used its strategic missiles. It hasn't used its most important weapons. It has taken the blows, and they're significant blows, but it still conserves most of its power in a significant way that would enable it to fight a long war, whether on the ground or a rocket war, and to disturb life in northern part of Palestine or the central part of Palestine, and even, escalate to a situation where they could target key infrastructure and otherwise. So I think that's important for also people to note, is that while Israel has expended some of its most important elements in this campaign, it has also, Hezbollah has still conserved, and of course with losses. I mean, the pager attacks and walkie-talkies targeted a lot of the Hezbollah members, whether in the civilian sector of Hezbollah movement or also the military sector. The taking out of the military command and the leadership, and also some of the political leaders in Hezbollah, is also significant. But I think what is fundamental also is this kind of Orientalism around how Israel designs operations. And what I mean by that is that Israel kind of, built through its military operational design. I mean, there's this whole history of what is called operational theory and operational design or operational art, which actually historically comes from Soviet Union and from Soviet theoretical engagement with what a military operation should be. And it's called operational art. And Israel has appropriated that and has integrated within its military of how we can double down on intelligence and our advantage in power, including specifically air power, and at the same time create a shock in the system of the enemy. So in many instances, what that actually translates to is that, Israel thinks by taking leadership and then, creating these shock moments that create a lot of distrust, a lot of, moment of disruption in the communication system, in the resistance movement, etc. It thinks that, it takes out or is able to actually completely destroy an organization like the Lebanese resistance. But one of the fundamental aspects of resistance is the ability of the movement to be hybrid, meaning that it could act like an army with command and control structure, but it could also at any moment move from this kind of highly rigid hierarchical structure to a highly flexible movement where cells and sectors are acting autonomously without the need to go back to any form of command chain to do what is supposed to be done on the larger strategic picture of how they defend, how they act, what weapons to use, what weapons not to use, etc. So there's a lot of autonomy within this movement. That's why this movement, despite being large and despite acting like an army, it's not necessarily a traditional army in any significant way. Of course, there are decisions on a strategic level that Hezbollah has to decide, like should we use the rocket arsenal that we have and other that, but that's something that could easily be directed by a military leadership or by a political leadership. So in fact, despite the importance of these blows, and I don't want to underestimate them because they are important and they are significant, and Israel was successful in them, they are not as Israel is trying to present them. They do not actually defeat Hezbollah. Hezbollah hasn't, used its most important weapons in this fight yet. And Israel is just digging deeper into a quagmire that it tried in the past. Lebanon. Lebanon for the Israelis, should only be beautiful from the outside. And, there's a lot of trauma in Lebanon. There's a lot of history of being killed, defeated, and with a lot of people, overcoming, even in terms of creativity and innovation, their own military inventiveness. And these couple of blows that Israel has dealt, yes, I mean, they are significant. But I think that, they're probably learning the wrong lesson. And probably, and again, nothing inevitable, that their tactical operational successes that they have accumulated in the past couple of weeks through assassinations and these shocks will turn to a strategic defeat as they penetrate deeper into Lebanon. Whether they remain there long term or whether they reach a stalemate and are incapable of actually achieving what they set out to achieve, I think Israel will not be able to create any kind of strategic political shift in relation to Hezbollah as they claim that they will able to. But they're high on their own supply, as you said, Jared. They feel that they need to cleanse. They need to cleanse from. I've already destroyed the mic, as we said before. They need to cleanse themselves from their past failures in Lebanon, specifically in the ground invasion. And it's surprising to me after 1 year of fighting in Gaza, after being tired from ground warfare. A lot of these units maybe have not fought in Gaza and are fresh, but at the same time, a lot of these units have fought in Gaza. A lot of these soldiers have been there, and I think they're setting themselves up for a strategic failure. But I don't want to give people too much hope. I mean, we might be shocked again and things go the bad way as well.
Yeah, we could be shocked, Abud, but at the same time, we should be wary of falling into Israel's propaganda about it being the unstoppable, omnipotent kind of force that they try to, advertise themselves as, because that kind of there's a lot of I agree with you, by the way. Like, I'm not saying that this is in disagreement. I'm just trying to build on it that yes, it was a significant blow, but also we need to put it within the proper historical context. Like, for example, when the pager attack first happened, people were coming up with these bizarre theories that they were using, waves from satellites to destroy any electronic device anywhere in the world. And people were like, oh, well, Israel can get anywhere and can touch anybody it wanted to. And I think it's important not to fall into kind of that propaganda. Like, yes, they have obviously competent intelligence and assassination capabilities, but they're also not the omnipotent power that they try to portray themselves as. A lot of things goes under their noses, and as Hezbollah has been able to build a whole arsenal in the north. And just to add to what you said, the regional dynamics are completely different. There's been much more cohesion now within the axis of resistance. We have supply networks. We have tunnels that didn't exist in 2006 and 2000. We have also the technological aspect. Hezbollah now is much more sophisticated with its military weapons and with its rockets and such as it was before. So I think there's a lot of these things that would make even trying to establish this kind of buffer zone that they might try to do very, very costly. in every single way. And I feel that they are not as tolerant of losses as we are, because I mean we have no other opportunity or choice, but they are. And you see how a rocket exploding over Tel Aviv can put 1 million people in shelters, and that's just not the kind of life they signed up for. They came to be settlers and to live, as the top hierarchy. They didn't come here to live in shelters. So I think that's also another aspect of the psychological, element that's at play.
Yeah, appreciated it. We were joking beforehand that at some point during this live that Aboud was going to smack his mic and break it, and it happened. So
Well, I
It didn't
break
break; it survived.
I think
survived.
he did. Didn't you bust it off the platform or something though?
Yeah, it went mute, I think, but it's still here. It's
All right.
standing. I think, yeah. I mean, it's standing steadfast, Jared. Don't.
Okay, standing steadfast. All
It
right.
adapted.
So I do want to get into the settler aspect a little bit, as well as the U.S. imperialist aspect here, because one of the things, and this is just, it partly comes from my observations of Western media, right? Which I don't, again, I recognize as propaganda. I don't take it at face value, but it does tend to tell us different things about the ambitions, right, of the empire and so on. And we'll get in a moment. Later I want to talk a little bit about the latest round of Iranian strikes, but even there's a shift. So obviously there's been a lot of BS in the West about the idea of wanting a ceasefire and so on. And the reality is, as Matt Miller recently clarified, for anyone who missed it, I could maybe even play the clip in a minute here, but he was quite clear the other day. He was talking about a ceasefire with respect to Lebanon, and they were saying that actually, I'll play it real quick. I'm gonna play this clip. It's just a quick one, and I think it'll give people some context for this discussion of what I'm talking about a little bit. All right.
What we're seeing in Lebanon, we saw a pattern with regards to Rafah. First, the U.S. saying that they wouldn't want to see Israel conducting major operations. Then Israel going ahead with what they called limited operations, and then this continued tolerance of sort of day-to-day attacks. That has led to over 44% of all buildings in Rafah being either destroyed or damaged, according to satellite photos. Which is to say that there might not have been a major operation in Rafah, but there was cumulative attacks that led to a good deal of destruction. So how does this precedent of Rafah portend for Lebanon?
So every conflict is different, but if you look at what we continue to engage with Israel about when it comes to Lebanon, is ensuring that they have the ability to attack terrorist targets, terrorist infrastructure, a terrorist organization. But ultimately, we want to see a diplomatic resolution.
But was that the case with Rafah, for instance, not just in Rafah, but
we've never wanted to see a diplomatic resolution with Hamas.
Well, okay. Well, what about the ceasefire?
We wanted to see a ceasefire, but we have always been committed. We have always been committed to the destruction of Hamas. We did want to see a ceasefire, but we have always made clear that we wanted to see a different authority moving forward in governance of Gaza.
Okay, but so for instance, other UN satellite image shows that 66% of Gaza structures have been damaged. And you earlier today said that the U.S. supports the targeting of terrorist infrastructure, not civilian infrastructure. Does the U.S. believe 66% of Gaza's buildings are terrorist infrastructure?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Which is why we have been engaged to try to reach a ceasefire to end that conflict, which is why we have been pushing for a ceasefire to months. And I wish that Hamas would come to the table and work with us on a ceasefire. As you heard me saying earlier, Hamas has been absent for weeks, won't even respond to the mediators putting forward ideas asking whether they would agree to a ceasefire or not. Look, you can talk about Israel and the culpability that Israel has and the tough decisions that Israel needs to make.
That's enough of that idiot. Anyway, what I wanted to actually, it wasn't so much the latter part, where he was talking about, Hamas or whatever, but that point about the very, like, wanting to make very clear right? Like that's what he sort of stops and he's like, wait, I want you to understand, like we have never wanted a diplomatic resolution with Hamas, right? And then later talking about they won't come to the table, right? It's like, um but the point being where I wanted to go, right, is that there's within the media more broadly right now in the West, there's a lot of one, it started kind of with the pager attacks, this very like this lauding of like how sophisticated and whatever, like all these positive adjectives, right, on this very terroristic, form of violence. And then the sort of support for the ground invasion, right, of Lebanon, which has been quite clear. There hasn't been any kind of waffling about this from the West or from the administration. And then now, with the sort of, okay, yeah, Israel has to respond to Iran, kind of thing. And so part of what, and I'm thinking about this in relation also to Gaza. I'm thinking about it in relation to the expansion of settlements in the West Bank, right? Of there is this, I would say, growing set of voices, at least within the West, about supporting a larger regional war, right? Which has not been, mostly the discussion has been like we want to avoid that, and that's still, I'd say, the kind of dominant line within the administration right now. But there's a growing set of, I mean, New York Times, other opinion articles and things like this that are saying like, this is the opportunity for the United States to reconfigure the region, basically. This is the kind of language that they're using. They have other terms, but and then, this obviously also goes alongside a historical Israeli settler colonial ambition, right? Of seeing territory well beyond what, none of the territory is theirs, first of all, but seeing the territory well beyond what they currently, occupy and control as theirs, as given to them by God, actually. And so I'm interested in how you all are perceiving these discourses. I mean, there's the ambition, and then the ambition actually has to meet with whatever the actual reality of these sort of possibilities are. But it's just interesting to me because there's a shift in discourses, and they seem to be kind of aligning with one another, right, in terms of the ambitions of the US and Israel. And I don't want to suggest that they're ever truly at odds, but I think that there's a way in which the US supports Israel long term because of the benefits that they see Israel as providing, right, as this, defensive force, as this force that's capable of liquidating other, threats, quote unquote, or challenges in the region, right? And as this kind of, yeah, settler colonial garrison sort of state. But it might be at other moments in history, right, where the US would say, yeah, we support it. We want it to defend itself, but we don't actually want it to cause us more problems, quote unquote, in the region by being very aggressive and so on. And so, anyways, I'm just curious how you two are kind of thinking about this right now in terms of these kind of settler colonial ambitions and these imperial ambitions in this moment.
But go ahead. I took the first two.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that how we think of Israel. I mean, Israel is not very different than the dependency that Ukraine has had on the United States in terms of fighting its war. Although we might, at least respect the Ukrainians for being able to sacrifice a lot in the war with Russia, no, and putting a lot of their men and soldiers, on the battlefield and killing and getting killed. So Israel is a highly dependent colony. I mean, and this is just a fact. I mean, yes, Israel is conducting these operations, but it's not Israeli brilliance that have made them possible. And I don't want to minimize Israeli own power sources or what they do in terms of intelligence and how they've perfected, or I wouldn't say perfected, but at least how they, created a war machine that is significant and capable, and in many ways has been able to fend for itself historically in the region and establish a settler colony despite the will of the Arabs and the whole region more broadly. But despite that, I mean, Israel is a wholly dependent nation. This is what this war revealed to us. It's a dependent colony. It needs the weapons. It needs the American industrial base. It needs the diplomatic cover. It needs American backing, and it is the bulldog that America uses in the face of the region. And now, on the battlefield, after costing America a huge embarrassment in terms of its soft power in the world, and after committing all these massacres as a primary mode of fighting the war in Gaza and destroying Gaza, now it's trying its luck with the second front that it sees important, which is with Hezbollah. Now there's two options here. Again, the first option is an attempt to de-link Hezbollah and the Lebanese resistance more broadly from the front in Gaza, so that they would be able to finish their job in Gaza in a way that does not, include other fronts being in participation, or they're going for, or flirting with the possibility of weakening, degrading, or perhaps even defeating decisively the entire axis of resistance, which means regional war. And the signs for that are growing. Is that the Americans, of course, will contemplate this. Why not? I mean, if they could weaken Iran, if they could weaken, the alliance system that Iran has also supported and supplanted in the region, or, built through years, if it could weaken significantly Hezbollah, if it could force these forces to submit to American hegemony in the region, then, and they think they're capable of doing that with minimal cost to the global economy, to their standing in the world, to their ability to, for the loss of soldiers. If they think they have the capabilities to do that, then why not? I mean, and that's why the rhetoric is slowly but steadily shifting. Maybe we should teach Iran a lesson. Maybe in teaching Iran a lesson, we'll teach China a lesson. We'll teach also Russia a lesson. We'll teach all these growing competitors a lesson that, in the face of war, we will not hesitate, and we'll back out our allies, and we'll give them all the means necessary to defeat their enemies. And, in grand strategic scale, America is also thinking about Taiwan here, about the South China Sea here, about its alliance system in Europe, and keeping Europe at bay, and showing Europe that it's also going to stand by its allies, and that it will not shy from backing their allies even when they commit outright genocidal crimes in for instance in the region that we exist in. So I think that's a real possibility. I think that's what also Prime Minister Netanyahu is trying to push for. No, that's what his whole strategy is, to drag the U.S. into a wider configuration and war in the region. I don't think Israel on its own can fight this war, but Israel needs America to actually fight it with it. And slowly and steadily, by showing its capabilities on the ground and the battlefield, Israel might be able to convince the Americans of the necessity of such a war, and the opportunity that these operational or some of these operational successes will convince American policymakers and strategists in the Pentagon and the CIA that maybe this is the opportunity to actually degrade Iran more broadly. So the risk of all-out war, I think, is not insignificant. It has been on the table since the first moment the Palestinian fighters entered the Gaza envelope, and it remains and grows as time moves on, because Israel will continue, or will try and attempt to escalate as much as it can, either getting itself in trouble and needing Americans to help, or by convincing the Americans that if they and their Arab allies are willing to pay the price, they might come out triumphant and successful, and actually change, the geopolitical picture that has been built in the past 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, I think this whole media's narrative of kind of like this bumbling empire that, oh, Biden is being dragged into something he's not interested in, or that Biden is so mad at Netanyahu, and all these, leaked articles, supposedly leaked articles that show up every couple of weeks. It's absolutely nonsense, especially that the United States has all the power and all the leverage in the world to swiftly end anything where they actually interested in. But I think they actually see an actual opportunity to reconfigure the region. And this becomes more obvious and it becomes clear when you understand Israel as an extension of US influence, as an outpost for Western imperialism, rather than its own, like as an allied nation, quote unquote, that just needs some help in the region, because that's definitely not the dynamics at play here. The dynamics at play is that as a client state, it's been exceedingly clear that Israel cannot fight its own war. It cannot simply, even not even talking about Lebanon and Iran, which are definitely escalations, but Israeli Air Force commanders were saying that without munitions, they wouldn't be able to fight the war for another 2 months. And that's only in Gaza. This was before the war began escalating in Lebanon. This was before the Iran strikes. So it becomes very clear that this is an outpost propped up by Western imperialism, for those interests. And like Aboud said, this has come at the cost of a lot of soft power. There are people who don't want to work with any American organizations, German organizations anymore. We're talking about this whole, institution of Western culture, quote unquote, academic freedom, journalistic freedom, the ones that they actually try to say that that's their values, but we know better. It's all coming down, collapsing. They're arresting students for protesting. They're shutting down journalists. They're doing everything. They're even at a point where a Security Council resolution is non-binding. Why? Because it targets Israel. It's this whole unfolding and kind of undoing of the whole World War II kind of value system, at least alleged value system. We know that that's not how it is when it comes to officially designated enemies of the West. That's never how it's worked. But even the weaponization of this kind of language, it's hitting a wall. It's become so obvious that the system, the world, is not how that works. It's very anarchic. It's whoever might makes right. And I think what October 7th helped accomplish is that it kind of put all the cards on the table. You have all these, neighborly, friendly, lovely Arab countries who talk about brotherhood. Now they're shooting down missiles targeting Israel. All the cards on the table. Nothing is hidden anymore. We see the actual power dynamics at play. They're very naked to the eye. We see actually how the relations in the world work. And that, I think, opens up a lot of opportunities. It opens up the box, basically, that we've been trapped into, to think about the future and how the future looks like. So I think that's a very important kind of pivotal moment. What happened after October 7th? We see this whole kind of ecosystem collapsing in on itself, and it seems it's completely naked. And I think that's something that we shouldn't underestimate. This is not going to be shown in a year or two. This is going to be a cumulative thing that will be shown in the next decades. But definitely the idea of a regional war, if the US didn't think that it would get something out of this reconfiguration of the region, it would simply just put a leash on Israel, because it can very clearly do that when it wants to. And the United States has done that in the past under multiple presidents. Even like Republican right-wingers like Reagan saw that Israel is damaging its interests in the region. But nowadays we have to ask, what would bring the United States to stop supporting Israel? And it definitely has to become some sort of actual threat to American interests, which they obviously do not think it is at this point. This doesn't mean obviously abandoning Israel. It doesn't mean that they will stop supporting it anyway, but it could reconfigure the thing. Maybe they give up on the idea of a Jewish state and they say, let's do a South Africa solution. Everybody's equal, but you're still, a base for imperialism in the region. Anything is possible, depending on the outcome of obviously what happens in the next decade or so, and how it happens in this war, how successful Israel is in accomplishing all of this. And it's anyone's game at this point. So we'll see what happens, especially in Lebanon. I think it's a very pivotal and important kind of crossroads for what happens going forward.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think, I want to talk about the strikes from Iran a couple days ago on October 1st as well. There's a couple of different layers of that I want to talk about. One is, it seemed that these are qualitatively more significant attacks than the one that took place in April, in terms of the number of impacts, right? It's hard because of the military censorship to know the real extent. We probably will never know the full extent of what the damage from them was, but there's a lot of videos that clearly show, and I mean, you're both in Palestine. I'm sure you could see to some extent too, um, the that these strikes are not just being intercepted in the air, right? But they are actually making impact, on the ground. They're getting through the multiple layers of Israel's air defense, missile defense, shields. Um, and obviously now there's the question of, kind of brinksmanship, or, how will Israel respond to this? There's no doubt that they will respond, I don't think, but what will that response look like? Will Iran then respond to that as they have said they will? Um, there's also kind of the timing, which is interesting. Like, they didn't do it immediately after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Iran. It was something that um, was timed very much with soon after Nasrallah's assassination and the ground invasion of Lebanon too. And that relationship, I think, between um, Lebanon and Iran, and Hezbollah, obviously in particular, is an important one. Um, and obviously the US was certainly supporting. They were trying to shoot down rockets over as they were passing through Jordanian airspace, um, and is supporting a response, right? That's already been made clear that the US supports Israel in responding, and is trying to then craft what that response will look like. Um, so yeah, I mean, there's sort of, I guess, two components, which is the sort of significance of this. And part of that significance question for me too is about a feeling, I think, that a lot of folks have, right? That nobody other than these non-state kind of asymmetrical forces in the region have been holding Israel to account in any way, right? So there's the whole, as you said, Fatih, with what you just laid out in terms of the international order, right, that's supposed to exist after World War II. There's nothing within it that actually stops Israel from conducting, genocide, or, mass targeting of civilians, or these war crimes, etc. Um, and so there's also, I think, the feeling that so many of us have about what does it mean when a state actually does respond, right, to something that Israel does, and set some kind of line and then respond to it, right, when so many others do not. Um, so there's that, but there's also the kind of larger question, I think, about Iran and Israel in this moment, and the West, and how this fits into the equation, I guess. So yeah, I know that's not a very clear question on my part, but I'm interested in what either of you think about this.
I could go for it. Look, the thing about Iran, first of all, had to respond for different reasons. First, it did not respond to the assassination of Haniyeh in Tehran, hoping that diplomacy would actually, bring something out. And they were betrayed by the Americans, basically, because the Americans didn't really force an agreement, which they can, but they didn't, because they allowed Israel to just perpetually go on with the war. So in many instances, I think on some level, I think the Iranians, the axis of resistance, is now much more convinced that the entire diplomatic maneuvering of the US is not to end the war, but it's only part of the war. It's meant to manage the escalation, giving Israel more time, creating much more patience on the part of the various actors within the axis itself, and protecting Israel from consequences. And even, with the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, a lot of the analysis are pointing out that there was an actual ceasefire agreement in place between Lebanon brokered by the US and in the United Nations, and that would actually also halt the fire in Gaza for 21 days. And it seems that that diplomatic maneuver was at least read by Hezbollah and by Iran as also part of the trick, if you want, that allowed for the assassination to happen. And Netanyahu still continued with his escalation paradigm. So I think that there's very little taste for diplomacy now, and for American diplomacy more broadly. And now, I think when it comes to the response from Iran, I think it was significant. It taught us three things. First of all, Iran can hit any strategic asset within Israel. So that is one element that is important for people to grasp, that despite that the attack was measured in many ways, it did not target civilian areas. It targeted mostly military bases, including Air Force bases within Israel, the Nevatim base in the south, and other bases around, including the Mossad headquarters, etc. Some of the hits were direct and significant, I think. And also it looks like that there is a heavy failure of the air defense system that Israel has. I mean, despite all the rhetoric, I'm speaking with confidence because we saw the rockets hit, like it wasn't, the eye doesn't lie, as they say. And despite everything that you're hearing from Western media, the last hit in April, we saw the air defenses working in the skies. We knew that the hit was not, that significant. And then we saw some of the explosions in some of the videos in April, but they were not significant. But this time around, it was an actual significant hit. And I think Iran was able to prove that it has the capability of hurting Israel strategically and hitting all of these areas, including air bases, civilian infrastructure, gas refineries, electricity. That capability is available and could be actually used in any significant major confrontation. So there is a proof of capability that now the Israelis have to consider as they attempt a retaliation, and also that the Americans have to consider as they also look at any possible escalation, and what would it mean to also their own forces in the region, to their own bases, and to the cost that such an escalation would actually incur on the global economy in a fragile period with elections and all of that. But it doesn't mean that cool-headed people will triumph. I mean, in many ways, there is a drive within American foreign policy makers, and I think that there's a conversation happening somewhere within the U.S. administration between those who are saying this is an opportunity to deal a blow to Iran, and with people saying we should tread carefully. So I don't think that the Americans are acting in one pulse, one heart, and having the same let's say opinion around what should be done and how it should be done, and what is what they should let Israel get away with in terms of the response and retaliation against Iran. But I think, at least from our perspective, despite the fact that there's no real human casualties except for, at least that Israel has confessed to, except for one Palestinian that was killed by a falling rocket that was hit by a interceptor in Jericho. I think that the Iranian attack was really significant, and I think that the Israelis are taking it quite seriously because it does also disrupt their plans. I mean, if you deprive Israel from their Air Force bases, the question of how Israel would use its Air Force would become much more complicated. And remember, Israel is very dependent on its Air Force, very dependent on its air assets in any war that it commits. I mean, of course, it has drones, it has other capabilities, tanks, etc. But it's very dependent in its offensive attacks specifically on its Air Force. And, the signs are worrying for Israel on that front. Not only can you hit it in civilian infrastructure, but you can also, construct an attack plan that takes out. And this is where Hezbollah's assets are important. And that's part of the reason I think that also Hezbollah has not necessarily used its rocket arsenal. I'm not sure about that, but I think that they're preserving that power in a much more significant regional war. So they're absorbing a lot of attacks that might have led other organizations to, attempt a strategic equilibrium, trying to hurt more, civilian centers within Israel, hitting key civilian infrastructure. But beyond the idea of attempting to confine what Israel hits within Lebanon by preserving these, by preserving this rocket arsenal, I think that this rocket arsenal will come in handy in any significant regional war, and will actually prove that it will be used at that critical juncture within that paradigm of escalation. In one of the last Nasrallah speeches, he was pointing this out. Hezbollah and Iran are now playing for a long game. They're thinking that this war is gonna be long, and part of that kind of long game needs to preserve power, to try to absorb as many blows as you can, try to set some red lines at the same time, but at the same time, await the moment to really pounce and use the significant power that you have. And I think that's part of what is at play, at least in this critical crossroad.
Yeah, I also think that the very fact that Iran was able to strike, and I don't mean just technically, I also mean the political will and the military will to strike, that is a collapse of Israeli deterrence. That is something that's very significant. We saw also a collapse of American deterrence with the Ansarullah in Yemen and the Red Sea. Who would have thought that Ansarullah would be able to block the Red Sea for almost a year at this point? This was never something that you would have thought of 10 years ago. There has been a shift in power, and it's very real and it's very serious, and the Americans are very worried about that, which is probably what is pushing them towards this more radical action and supporting Israel in doing this. Now, I think that there's definitely being a lot of censorship. There's definitely more probably casualties or damages, because they've also told the settlers, do not take any videos, do not share any photos. I mean, if it hit nothing and they intercepted 80%, like they said, that they would have been fine with people going out, like just show how useless it was, right? But no, that's not what's happening. The opposite is happening. And like Boot said, that there is Hezbollah and also Ansarullah, by the way, they also have more ballistic missile and larger ballistic missile stockpiles. Also, Al-Hashd in Iraq, they are going for a long burn kind of strategy. They are waiting slowly to escalate the ladder of escalation. Let's just say they're not unveiling all of their top weapons from the get-go, and from only what Nasrallah was talking about over the last 10 years. We know that Hezbollah has hundreds of times those kinds of rockets that they launched, and that's only considering like from 10 years ago. Probably has much more sophisticated weapons now, much more damaging weapons. And from what we saw from Iran, if they wanted to hit civilians, they could, but that's just not, they do not see it as strategically valid. They don't see it as a strategic value to hit a civilian area, because it will not degrade the capability of the army to respond to them. And that's their main kind of objective. Conversely, when the IDF or the IAF hit, we talked about the Dahi doctrine, where they want to destroy as much civilian infrastructure as possible to make life as miserable as possible, and they want people to rise up against Hezbollah in Lebanon or in Hamas in Gaza, depending on who they're striking at the point. So that's completely two different, philosophies or strategies for the long term of how to do this war. And it's actually, like as Aboud said, that they were trying to maintain this kind of escalation so it doesn't end up erupting in a complete regional war. They have been playing it, if you listen to US media or European media, you think that these are like just madmen shooting rockets at every place, but they've been incredibly rational about their choice of where to hit and how to hit. They've been very rational about even accepting basically, not responding for the assassination of Haniyeh if it would lead to a ceasefire in Gaza. These are things that nobody would dream Israel would ever do, because that's just not how they function. They have to be the mad dog. They have to have this shock and more shock. They have to bomb everything and show that they are not to be messed with. And the fact that this kind of deterrence has collapsed, I think this is very, very significant. And I think that's what really terrifies Israelis and terrifies the Americans, that if American ships can now be hit by suicide boats from the Houthis with almost no cost to them, or that if you can shoot rockets at the northern settlements for almost a year, pushing hundreds of thousands of people into shelters, that's a huge, like, they lost the north basically. And that's how they feel, and that's how all the mayors of these settlements are talking about it, because it's a very significant effect. So the fact that this deterrence fell apart, and this is even without kind of adding in what happens if the West Bank cuts loose at some point. What if the PA collapses, or if the PA just thinks it can't keep the people controlled anymore, and an actual intifada breaks up? They can't fight all of these fronts at the same time. They'll be stretched way too thin, and that's actually when you might see the Americans coming in and saying, hey, we need to stop this, when there's an actual threat, because they can't nuke Palestinians in the West Bank, as much as they'd like to do that to Iran if it got too much out of control, because that's what they keep threatening. But otherwise, yeah, I think it's a significant development that this there's a shift in the power in the region, and it's hard to deny it. And this was something that was unimaginable 20 years ago. I mean, we saw its beginnings after the 2000 and 2006 wars in Lebanon, but to be to this state and able to shut down a whole sea, it's something that we wouldn't be talking about 20 years ago. And I think this is kind of the step forward that October 7th really allowed. It led to all of this kind of developments, and I think it will lead to even more developments in the future. I don't think that you can come back from this. I think that the genie can't be put back into the lamp. And I mean, maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I do think that it has been kind of a mortal blow to the image of Israeli invincibility in the region, even though they're trying very, very difficult, very hardly to kind of restore that image of deterrence, that of a mad dog, that whatever you do, you'll pay 10 times the cost. And it's not been working that great for them in North and the North and South Lebanon for this time. And it's not, doesn't, I mean, like Aboud said, there might be more kind of tricks up their sleeve, but I do tend to agree that they've basically used most of them at this point. But again, nobody can tell the future.
Appreciate it. And I want to kind of wrap with a question about October 7th, about Al-Aqsa flood. We are a few days away from a year. I don't think, at least me initially, I certainly didn't imagine that we would be here a year on, and that we might be, that there would not have been, a ceasefire, that we would still be in a war that, as Justin Potter says before each episode of his sit reps, no end in sight, right? Like we don't know. Not to say that it could end, it could be wrapped up, but it doesn't. There's not a clear possibility or trajectory that's easy to see to that end. Um, and I think, both of you, and Rowan as well, you all have talked about how, I mean, I think it was Rowan's piece actually that was October 7th was an act of decolonization, or Al-Aqsa flood was an act of decolonization. And, Aboud, you and I have talked a lot over the last year about the significance of October 7th as well. And yeah, I mean, I just wanted to give a moment to kind of reflect on its significance a year later. I mean, obviously, we are still in a world that where its significance is clear in nothing else, in that normal, whatever normal was, has not been reestablished and really can't be. Whatever the new normal will be has not really been determined at this point. But I think it was you earlier, Aboud, in this conversation, who also talked about the significance of developing a guerrilla army with the kind of capabilities that the resistance had, that Hamas, that Qassam, and all the other resistance factions had in Gaza. given this little piece of land and the lack of control over the kind of entry points into it. Um, so yeah, talk about just talk about the significance for you as you kind of reflect back on October 7th, a year later.
Well, I mean, it's always difficult to reflect when, you know, a moment has not ended, you know, like reflection kind of assumes distance from something. And I think that it's hard to go back in time and try to like look as if things have already unfolded or changed, or, you know, as you said, Jared, a new normal has not been set, to be honest. I mean, recently somebody asked me to like write a piece reflecting on October 7th, and I had a hard time, you know, trying to reflect. Again, I wouldn't use that word. I think that one of the significant elements, and I think also part of the conversation that we had in the past, specifically the last time we had, was, you know, how is time really working? You know, Israel is using and expending a lot of its force, using some of its tricks now, creating these opportunities for assassinations and, you know, operational successes, if you want, and still continuing with its slaughter and massacres as a primary mode of engagement with the region. And, you know, when we think about the possibility of long-term effects, even if Israel, you know, preserves itself and it shows the will to fight and persevere, you know, because I think one of the fundamental aspects of October 7th was to give kind of the settler state and its society the options. The first option was, you know, to reflect, which they refused to do, and perhaps to think through what they have done to create the conditions for the rise of October 7th. I mean, of course, Israelis are incapable of doing that, it seems, to think or reflect, or, you know, they think that force is the only language, power is the only way to sustain themselves as a Jewish supremacist state that is built on top of Palestinian land and Palestinian lives and Palestinian dreams and hopes. So they're incapable of thinking that. I mean, I'm always surprised when people ask, you know, pundits, what option did Israel have? And I always say to people, like, you know, after they cleared the area surrounding Gaza, the Gaza envelope, the settlements that surround it, there was no real necessity for war. They could have chosen other paths, including a path for, you know, historic reconciliation, of acknowledging their original sin. Of they're the powerful state, they're the ones with the nuclear weapons, they're the ones that can actually approach a much weaker side and you know, engage in a political language and rhetoric. But they went for this kind of mad, we need to prove that we're so powerful, we need to prove that we still have a capable army, we need to prove that we're, you know, capable of creating these awe moments of wonder in our military excellence and power. We need to take our enemies, we need to teach them a lesson. And, you know, in many ways, it's very surprising. I mean, it's always surprising because, you know, the Orientalist discourse on Arabs is that we're the ones that are emotional and led by our instincts and, you know, incapable of strategic thinking. And when we look at Israel, really, is that you know, it's a society driven by, you know, these psychic forces and desires. It's true that they have capabilities and they've focused and fixated on these kind of operational or tactical successes and trying to accumulate them, but it doesn't seem to me that they have a real strategy around what they're doing. And I've always, you know, I've studied Israel quite a lot. I've studied their military journals and I've looked at them deeply. And I think that, you know, they're risk takers. Sometimes they do these kind of how do you call it, like adventures, and they see what happens, and maybe they create new opportunities and new political possibilities. But I think that in many ways they've chosen down a bloody road. They've proven to the entire region, even those living within the confines of states today that are, you know, that have some sort of agreements with Israel or are cooperating with Israel, that these are not people that, you know, this region can coexist with or actually live with. That, entire generations are now battered, but entire generations will also rise, and have a personal problem with this state and what it has committed. So the long-term effects of what is happening, nobody's thinking about that, but because everybody's thinking about how we stitch back Israel into a state that everybody respects and fears. But I think that in many ways, Israel is digging its own grave in the medium run, or the long term, or even in the immediate run. That's one of the elements. But I think the other significant element of October 7th, that it pushed all the actors into a situation where they have to reckon with each other, and that's what we've seen now develop in September, more focused. For the past 11 months or so, now 12 months or almost a year, Hezbollah did participate. The Yemenis did, include the semi-blockade on the Red Sea, and Iran has been kind of engaged in both diplomacy and some military actions. But there's two major projects in the region. One led by Iran, trying to develop the means through which this region can be liberated from Western imperial hegemony, and one led by the US and supported by one of the biggest or largest, if you want, American bases in the region, which is Israel, and with Arab states that are in one way or another part of this alliance system, and for sustaining American hegemony in the region. And now they're slowly but steadily clashing together. And Gaza on October 7th, when the leaders or the people who decided to take the decision, I think that's exactly the strategy behind October 7th on a much larger scale, is that this is the time to change the configuration of the region. And what the Palestinians can do in this equation is to push everybody through this operational success that happened on October 7th to basically come and clash together. Of course, it doesn't mean that's the only factor that played a role in how, the leadership of the Hamas or Qassam, envisaged. And I think that on multiple occasions, Hamas was more than willing to end the war in the early months of this war, specifically when it seemed that at some level you've had operational success, you've taught the Israelis a lesson, but at the same time, you can still preserve much of Gaza in terms of its infrastructure and protect people from the massacres that were occurring on a daily level. And I think in November we saw, the approach to that when Hamas decided to release a lot of the Israeli prisoners in Gaza in exchange for this kind of humanitarian ceasefire that was started. But I think that in thinking through October 7th was meant to reveal what is the real position of all these actors. Are they really willing to go to war? Are they willing really to fight until the end? What exactly is their will to fight? And I think, the Palestinians, once again, were able to bring the region or play with the settings in the region and get these two projects, if you want, in the region to collide and clash. And we still are perhaps in the beginning, maybe we're in the end, nobody knows. I mean, we tried in the past to kind of like envisage a point where this ends, because if we're just thinking about the war in Gaza, as we can all see, I mean, Israel has achieved what it really can achieve in Gaza, short of ethnic cleansing, of a wide ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza. It might, get to some more prisoners or kill another leader here or there, but in large part, I mean, the war in Gaza, doesn't have much more to do. I mean, you've already destroyed most of the buildings, you've already destroyed most of the infrastructure, you've confined the people, you've placed them in a terrible condition, you're still committing massacres, and the people are not going to submit. I mean, that's just it's not going to happen. In Israelis' wildest dream, that it's not going to unfold or occur. So now they're going to the northern front. Now they're going to clash more directly with with the regional forces that attempted in many ways to not reach that clash as well, to back the Palestinian resistance, to try to convince the Americans and the Israelis, okay, now you've had enough, maybe we can reach some sort of ceasefire agreement. But it seems the Israelis are, committing themselves to this kind of reconfiguration and placing that pressure on the resistance forces in the region to, think that, okay, maybe we didn't want this confrontation at this critical juncture in time, but now this is a war that the Americans and the Israelis are forcing upon us, and we're in a defensive position, and we need to fight it. And I think that's what, in the past month has been proven to be the case, that, it's not time for diplomacy or political, engagement. It's time for the battlefield to actually give us the outcomes of how this war unfolded. I don't want to predict the future, and I think it's hard for us to reflect back. I think there is a lot of, pain, a lot of monstrosity that, we haven't seen for a long time unfold. There's a lot of, drastic changes in the demography in Gaza specifically, but even in the West Bank, there's a lot of things going on as well. Fears, anxieties, psychic forces that are also at play here, uncertainty, and we still live in that moment. It's really very difficult to go back and reflect, because again, I mean, you need distance from an event, and I don't think we're getting that distance anytime soon. I mean, and I think one of the elements that I think is central only, and that's the last thing I'll say, is that a lot of people want to kind of go back to before October 7th, to return to this normal, specifically in Palestine, because, there's this whole panic and uncertainty and anxiety coming with what a flood, as I think Al-Qassam described it well, a flood that floods the structures, deforms everything that we've known before, creates this moment of flux, a whirlwind, if you want, where we're like, caught in the eye of a storm and we don't know where we're going. But I think it's one of the most significant strategic event for a small guerrilla force to be able to actually get the world to, major conflict in the region, possibility of a collapse in the international economy, and trying to build that on the basis of a cry of liberation, of getting our people to a more dignified life. So, October 7th was that moment. And I think for us, it's not only about the operation itself, but its ripple effects that, continue to this day.
Thank you, Abud. Like, honestly, I struggle to add much meaningful commentary to what you said, because I feel like you basically summed up my feelings, and I think the feelings of a lot of people. I think one of the most significant parts also of October 7th is it was seen as us retaking the initiative, basically. We've been like stuck in a rut for such a long time, where we're reacting to everything and trying to, get a step ahead. And I think actually on October 7th, that we did take that initiative. It completely came out of surprise for a lot of people. The Israelis and a lot of Hamas, actually, according to some reports. And I think one of the also important kind of aspects of like what Aboud said, making all these actors interact with each other, I also think it brought to the front that, or rather dispelled the idea that, okay, Gaza is Gaza's problem, the West Bank is the West Bank's problem, because it became very obvious from the very beginning of the genocide that Israel does not view Palestine that way. Israel views it all as one unit that they want to basically ethnically cleanse and colonize and take over, and that if you act nice and well in the West Bank, that they'll give you some work permits. But it's all been shattered. Like, we see these settlers coming out and destroying Palestinian communities. We see how everything's being ramped up within 48. We see how it's going on to a war with refugees. Basically, the refugee camps are some of the hottest, areas of resistance. And I'm not just talking about the refugees in Palestine. I'm talking about now Lebanon. Also, the refugees are being hit. So, like, even after nearly 100 years, even after all the technology, after all of the world recognized it, Israel's still dealing with the sins of its day one. It's still dealing with the refugee population of Gaza that it expelled nearly 100 years ago, and they're still here, they're still resisting, and they refuse to be wiped out. And I think October 7th brought that all to the forefront in a way that, no, you cannot ignore Palestinians, you cannot ignore the injustice that you're doing, because for a longer time, they've been trying to basically bypass Palestinians. For the longest time, they were talking about, if Palestinians and Israelis make peace, then suddenly Israel will be accepted in the region. But nowadays, with all these normalization efforts, that's been completely bypassed. What Palestinians want, what Palestinians need, that is no longer part of any kind of equation. I'd argue it was never part of an equation, but not even rhetorically at this point, because you have Saudi Arabia, you have the Emirates, they're all, clamoring for normalization under the table or above the table. And this came and threw a wrench in it. And like Abud said, even the countries that have normalization or peace treaties with Israel, there's a huge, not resentment, even hatred growing for Israel because of what they do. And I don't know who I saw saying it, that whenever like a new Arab generation is born, Israel goes on, does something terrible that teaches everybody again what the Palestinian cause is about. And that's what we're also seeing, because for the longest time, they've been trying to desensitize Arab youth. They've been trying to desensitize all these different demographic groups that, like, oh, Israel's just a different country and we had some war and now we can go forward with peace and such. But this shows that Israel does not have a problem with Palestinians only. It has a problem with all Arabs. It has a problem with everything in the region. It is not a natural part of the region. It is a cancerous growth that is growing out and trying to colonize as many lands as possible. I mean, only yesterday they were buying 5 different countries. That's ridiculous for any country. And we're talking about even, vice president, nominees talking about Israel's right to expand. I think that the significance of October 7th is that what we said before is that it put all the cards on the table. Everything that we understood but was under the table has become on top of the table, and we understand now how actually who our enemies are and who our allies are, and all the talks, brotherly love from Arab countries turned out to be all this, nonsense that they sell to their people. But when it comes to reality, they help, Israeli and American jets shoot down rockets. So I think that's a significant point of October 7th. I mean, I wasn't even aware of October 7th to begin with, because in the early morning, like at 5 a.m., I left to our farm, and it's in the middle of nowhere. It has no internet connection at all. And I came back at 4 p.m. basically, and the world was upside down. That was absolutely there was an overflow, an overwhelming, kind of information that you to take that in. I would see reports that some forces reached, the outskirts of Hebron in some areas to the south, or that they were able to capture these military unit HQ and such. So it was. I again, we can't reflect like Abud said, because we're still living through it. But when you think about those first days, it's not unlike some of the, joy we felt when we saw the Iranian rockets falling on these military bases. There's this sense of kind of like, finally it's us breaking through the walls for once, rather than the other way around, where they destroy our houses and our walls. It was our bulldozer that was going through the wall that was keeping us, or keeping the people of Gaza in a ghetto for all this year, or in a concentration camp now, or whatever you want to call it. So it's a lot of, again, mixed feelings, because we knew what was going to follow. But it's definitely something that will become clear in the decades to come for sure. It's not something that we could really reflect on right now.
Yeah, appreciated. Um, I so something you both were talking about is that, made me think about one other point, which kind of takes it back a little bit to Nasrallah and also, I mean, in some ways to Oslo, but also these, as you said, normalization, these kind of paradigms. And, I mean, as you all have said, like October 7th has made everything very clear, right? In terms of like where do countries stand? What are they willing to do or risk, right? What are different forces or people within the region willing to do and risk, and also other places in the world. What are people in the US willing, or in the UK willing to do? Um, and there, one of the things that stands out to me a little bit within Nasrallah's thought, um, and a lot of the kind of movements within the axis, within the kind of Islamic movement orbit that has come about after the Oslo paradigm and after the kind of secular movements, decline, which also comes about at the end of the Cold War, with the end of, the support from, you know, Soviet Union and other places perhaps. But um is I think about the one, the clarity that Nasrallah had, right, about the idea that it is US imperialism, right, and that Zionism, that Israel was its expression, right, in the region, and that collaborating or normalizing with these forces, couldn't be done, right. And I think that I wonder about that trajectory also, because those are the forces I think that people look to in this moment, and say they're the ones who are being heroic, right? These are the people who are standing up. I think it's still quite clear to a lot of people, I would say a majority of people, right, at the people level, not the country, not the government level or whatever, but at the kind of human level across the world, that um, you know that the Palestinians have not had any modicum of justice, and have been, have faced genocide, have faced all kinds of horrific crimes, um, at the expense of Israel and the US and the broader West. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess part of what I'm asking is, like, within all those countries, right, which have those regimes that do normalize, that do collaborate within the West Bank, where also you all have the Palestinian Authority that has this, normalization or collaborative impulse. Like, do you think that, not immediately, but over time, kind of to that generational point you were making, Fatih, about that, Israel kind of reveals itself to every successive generation of Arabs, that we will continue to see maybe not the same resistance movements, maybe different ones, but we will continue to see resistance to, Western imperialism and Zionism, and that it will also become more of a problem also for states, where the states have taken this kind of collaborative normalization impulse over the years, based off of what people are seeing their own countries ultimately as being complicit in. I know that's a big question, but it's one that's on my mind.
I think actually Arab countries or regimes in general do view Palestinians as a threat, just the whole Palestinian cause in general. Just when you're talking about Egypt, for example, the one of the very few, and this is talking in the Mubarak days, one of the very few avenues where you could get a protest license or something was to go to a Palestine, to do a Palestine protest or demonstration. But obviously, because these organizers saw that everything was interconnected, it would not stay only as a Palestine protest. And the leadership of, for example, the 2011 protest wave, they cut their teeth in pro-Palestine on pro-Palestine protests, and that's how they learned how to organize. And that's how they learned it, because it was one of the few little spaces, which is why, by the way, Sisi even like bans groups like BDS and such. They're not even allowed to breathe in Egypt, because they're actually terrified of the ability of the Palestinian question to kind of mobilize people. So we see this kind Palestine as this kind of it's a question mark. It's a joker. Let's say they don't know how to deal with it, how it's going to go. It's a destabilizing cause seen for the Arab regimes who just want to have their normalization deals. They want to be able to have all their, support from the United States and be able to have all of these regular, trade agreements with Israelis. But the reality is that the vast majority of the Arab populations are very hostile to Israel and Zionism. And even in countries like Saudi Arabia, which is trying to normalize, there are huge, like the polls revealed, a huge number of the population are anti-normalization. And this was before the genocide even began. I believe that it would be a much higher number now. So it's from the very beginning, it seems that that our struggle is not only against Western imperialism, but also its reactionary Arab regime partners who are part of this same axis. But the difference is with Israel is that what questions people say, like, why can't, for example, the United States choose Qatar or the United Arab Emirates as its kind of base in the region instead of Israel? Like, has Israel outlived its usefulness? But the very thing that kind of separates Israel from these other populations is that the population in Israel is also very pro-America and pro-US imperialism, because that's their sponsor, that's their benefactor. An example of that, if we talk about the Iranian Revolution, the Shah was one of the strongest allies of Israel and the United States in the region. They invested a lot in him and they propped up his, absolutist monarchy. But the moment that his regime fell, the population kind of flipped. It became, part of the so-called axis of resistance and such. So that risk is not possible in Israel. That's why Israel is so special for Americans. That's why Israel has this important kind of status as an outpost, because that risk is not available. And I don't know if you remember, but also in 2011, when after Mubarak fell, like one of the first targets of the protesters was also the Israeli embassies and the American embassies. And that's why the American embassy right now in Beirut is being protected and not any other country. So definitely Arab states view the Palestinian question as this kind of Pandora's box that spells instability for them. And the Jordanians are absolutely terrified. There were talks about ethnically cleansing some Palestinians in the West Bank, and Jordan doesn't want to receive anymore. Egypt doesn't want to receive anyone from Rafah. That's why they've been, instead of letting aid in, they've been spending all that money building walls upon walls and buffer zones to keep Palestinians out. So it's difficult to see how these regimes could survive in the long run, because their very survival depends on their benefactor, America. And if, I don't know, Israel were to ever have some kind of setback or to fall out of favor in the United States for whatever reason, God knows what happens in 100 years' time. If it even exists in 100 years, probably not. But their survival as regimes, I don't see them as any long-time survivability, because they are all part of the same network. Like, entire countries were created basically to safeguard Israel's borders at some point. So, I don't know. It's Abu, do you have any? I'm sure you have something to add.
Well, I mean, dropped my mic again. Well, I think that his reflections are critical. Not everything aligns well for events generally. And one of the things that didn't align well with October 7th is the fact that in some of the Arab states we're talking about, and specifically outside of the Gulf, which benefits from highly advanced, oil-based economies where people live specifically outside of Saudi Arabia in a highly luxurious life, so while the population's empathy and sympathies are with the Palestinians, the type of life, the type of class position that they hold is quite different. Therefore, it would not be expected, based on also the nature of the countries that they live in, that there would be any significant revolutionary actions in these countries. But in Jordan, Egypt, in North Africa, and other places, I mean, the Arab world in the past 10 years have suffered from civil wars, from the breakdown of popular movements, labor unions, student movements, from state repression and counter-revolutionary forces, hammering down on all forms of collective gathering and organization. And it's important to note that without organizational capacity, generally speaking, you might have spontaneous revolts, and that really depends on, a specific mood or a specific energetic burst. but there needs to be organizational capacity to, sustain, raise questions, engage in intellectual discussions, provide avenues for effective political actions. And, October 7th did not align with this moment. October 7th aligned with the entrenchment of the counter-revolutionary forces that, emerged after the Arab revolts of 2011. So, I mean, it's not surprising to see that, there's not a lot of protests in Egypt, for instance, where tens of thousands are now in Egyptian prisons in one of the worst incarceration system in the world, or that in a fear of civil wars exists among the Arab population, and if the state is willing to repress and kill in any revolts, there's also this kind of fear that they do not want to participate in any action that would lead to just chaos. That this action would lead to something significant. So I do think that on some level, that is unfortunate for October 7th. That if it was a different moment, perhaps historically, that the more popular forces, labor unions, student movements that are more energetic would have served it much better in terms of organizing Arab societies, changing a bit of the dynamics, reigniting revolutionary fervor, not only in relation to Palestine, but also in relation to these collaborative regimes that exist, these form of despotic regimes that have, killed the potential of the Arabs more broadly, and sustained this kind of subservient or a relationship to America and Israel in the past couple of decades, at least since Camp David was signed by Egypt and Israel. So, I mean, this is the fact that, we're dealing with this, but I do think that October 7th will have an impact in the long term on, these Arab populations, on the more politically engaged, on the more, on the people in the Arab world looking for change, for significant change. And I think that it will correct some of also the misconceptions that rose with the Arab revolts in 2011, when, a lot of the young, Arab protesters, we're coming a bit into, change is only about transitioning into a democracy and creating a liberal economy. So that was slowly becoming the hegemonic model of thinking around what a revolution would actually bequeath. And I think they forgot another component. I'm here not to discuss what form of model of government should we have, but they forgot a very fundamental, important element, which is that this region will not have its real potential reach without having its own sovereignty. And as long as it remains subservient or remains, beholden by American hegemony and power, it will remain, weak. It will remain poor. It will remain. Its resources will remain the resources of the world, not its own resources. It will remain divided on behalf of Israel and on behalf of the economic interest that motivates the empire to sustain itself in this region and to control it and to control its resources, and by default to also deform its people and its the nations that exist here. So, I think that question of sovereignty will become more central in Arab thinking among new generations. And that question will also have to look more broadly on Israel, because the Palestinian cause is not about Palestinians. A lot of us are, hideous people, and we're not all necessarily nice. And it's not about us as Fathi or Aboud or I don't know, the people that live in Palestine only.
I'm nice though.
You're great, Fathi. But it's not about Arab sympathy to Palestinians, because we're just Palestinians living under oppression, or we're victims and we're Arabs and they should feel bad for us. Maybe that's some of the disposition in the Arab world, but I think it's a more fundamental question, because for Arabs is that what it means for their own societies and for their own states, for their own projects, for their own dreams, when they have to kneel in front of the empire and in front of Israel. What it means to their own future. I mean, enmity to Israel in the Arab world is not necessarily about, just its ability to kill Palestinian babies or Palestinian people or arrest us and commit brutal acts. It's also about their own future, and it's about their own interest, if you want. It's about what they want to reclaim in their own sovereignty, if they want to have a meaningfully political change in their own societies and countries. So the question for me is never about anybody coming to Palestine with this knack of oh, poor Palestinians. I mean, I really couldn't care less about that type of sentiment. I mean, I feel it. I understand that people might have feelings and might look at us through this kind of lens. But I think what is important is to ask a question also about what it means for Israel as a Western outpost in the region, as a embodiment, as it claims, of Western values and culture, to be committing this monstrosity for the West. What does it mean for people who claim to be civilizationally rational and superior? What it means for their own ethical and moral grounding? What it means for the relations between countries and regions and peoples and classes across, if you want, national, religious, cultural divides, to have this type of militaristic state implanted in a region where it shouldn't be, and to continue to brutalize the entire region within this kind of power dynamic and power play. So it's not only about a question of Arabs, it's also a question for you in the States, for everybody else, is that this is a highly cynical, imperial ploy, and it reflects on the values of the countries, on the truths of these countries, on what they claim is their own narrative. But beyond the narrative, it's also about how you build relations, what forms of relations are built between peoples across these boundaries. And when we're thinking revolution, or we're thinking the potential for revolution, whether it's in the Arab world or other places, I think this is important. Palestine and Israel is not only about the Palestinians and Israel. It's a place where a lot of things are concentrated, and a lot of struggles are concentrated. And that's why that question is as relevant to Egyptians as it is also relevant to people living in New York or Pennsylvania or somewhere else. It's a type of relations we want to hold, humans across these type of, if you want, divides or differences across the world, and specifically the relationship, this historic relationship with all its ebbs and flows between, the Arab region and other parts of the world, including North America and Europe.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. I mean, because I think, every time that, I hear the kind of rhetoric of, which is increasingly clear coming from certain quarters within the West of, these are battles for Western civilization, and so on, right? I'm like, why would, if this is what a battle for Western civilization looks like, then who the hell would want that? Like what is this? I mean, I know that they're appealing, to a certain idea that really goes all the way back to the Crusades, of this notion of the West and of Western civilization and what values and whatever. But it's like nothing has revealed the absolute moral and ethical bankruptcy of Western civilization more than the last 12 months, I think. And I agree, Aboud. I think, it is a way for us to rethink about all of the ways that what are our relations going to be, and what kind of world do we want to live in? These are much bigger questions. Is there anything else either of you wanted to say? I appreciate everything that both of you have shared today. It's been a great conversation.
No, for me, I mean, no, there's nothing really. I don't know if Fathi has something.
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you both. This has been great. Thanks to the folks, Laura Brarian, Angela, for supporting as you're listening to the live. Thanks to the chat. There's a lot of good discussion in the chat. Yes, East is a podcast recently did an episode on the Crusades with Adnan Hussan. Definitely, that's a good. I always appreciate the work that Sina does there, and Adnan Hussan is also Hussein is also with Guerrilla History, and so yeah, great folks. Definitely encourage people to check that out. Yeah, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much. This has been great. Free Palestine. It's good to be in conversation with you as always.
Thanks, Jared.
All right,
Thank you. Wonderful being here.